Today, we're going to think through the process of engaging with court-ordered or court-mandated volunteers completing community service and the different ways that you can interact with those volunteers. So we'll talk about your process of identifying and directing community service volunteers, establishing your pipelines, and finally, we'll talk through reporting options on your end and what volunteers can do. Now, depending on your organization, there are different ways that you might need to identify these volunteers or potentially even isolate them. So the first thing we need to understand is what your process entails. So let's walk through a couple common ways you might need to engage community service volunteers. And a good place to start is by asking these two questions. First, do I have a particular set of opportunities which are appropriate for court-mandated volunteers? And second, do I have a process for approving community service volunteers? Okay, let's take that one question at a time, starting with that first one. Do I have or do we have a particular set of opportunities which are appropriate for court-mandated volunteers? Now, this could be a singular event. Maybe there's only one thing that court-mandated volunteers can sign up for. Perhaps you have a set of events that are within that realm of what's appropriate. Perhaps your answer to that question is no, and those volunteers can sign up for whatever they need to as long as they've been approved. We'll kind of address that in a moment. Let's start from this concept that we do have a set of volunteers that we want to present to court-ordered or court-mandated volunteers. So in some capacity, you need to be able to identify those events. Now, if it's as simple as, well, we have one event they can do, well, then you can just direct those volunteers specifically to that one event. There are different ways to do that in Service. One thing I want to point out is if we go into search and manage existing opportunities, every event in the system, if we click on the name of it, has an option to send out a private invite, right? So you could have a hidden event that you send a private invite. You can also do a direct opportunity link, which will function with posted events only. So it has to be publicly posted. But if you just have one event that you want to direct volunteers to, you can just use that link, post it on your website, or you can use an embedded page and link directly to a particular event as well. So that's always an option. You can, of course, send people straight to one event. But let's say we have a set of opportunities that are in that world of they're appropriate for court-ordered volunteers. There are a couple ways you could approach that. My preferred way to do that is with tags. I like to use tags in particular because you can also add stickers to them. So if we go into our existing opportunities here, you can see I've already created a tag and a sticker for this concept. I've used a particular icon, but you can use lots of different icons in here. So I've tagged a number of my events as being court-ordered community service welcomed, right? So we can click on that tag on the admin side and we can see all the events that have that label. If I wanted to add a new event to that set, then what I can do is just go into whichever the event is. So let's say I want to add in my sort and repack event. I can click on the name of it. And then up at the top here is where my tags are housed for this event. And I can just click on Add Opportunity Tag. Now, if this is the first time that I'm creating this tag, then I would just type it out, whatever I want it to be called. In my case, I've already created it. So it's going to suggest the tag that already exists. And I can select that and click Add Tag. And now this tag has been added to this opportunity, and it's kind of included within that set. Now, this is useful from the perspective of someone who's just looking at your events. A volunteer can see all the events that have that icon, right? They can go through and view all that information there. But they can also click on that because I've added a sticker. They can see this sticker associated with that tag, and they can click on it, and then that will filter by that kind of option. So now my volunteers can select that if they want to, and they can do this themselves. And that's great if volunteers are kind of interested in poking around and figuring that out themselves. But a lot of times they might not even notice that you can click on that, right? In that case, you might want to be a little bit more directive. So what you can do is you can pre-filter this page by that tag. There are a couple different ways to do this. This has to do with kind of web integration. If you have questions about integrating service into your website, we're happy to have more conversation about that. But here's an example, right? I might send volunteers to a page on our website where I have filtered automatically by that tag. And this can be done in a couple different ways. In my particular example, I'm using kind of like a keyword filter. Don't worry about the particulars here. Like I said, if you need help with this concept, we're happy to walk through that with you. But I just want to point out that this is doable, right? So I can have a button on the right-hand side that says this is for court-ordered volunteers. They click on that, and then that shows them only the events that have that tag and therefore that sticker as well. So this is kind of my preferred way to isolate those events. If you need to then direct volunteers once they land on your volunteer page, you could have a button that says court-ordered volunteers, click here, and then that would show them only their opportunities. One more component to this, I didn't really talk about adding stickers in here. If you're not familiar with this, we do have a webinar on this subject kind of as a whole. But just in brief, when you are logged into the admin side, if you go into the tag cloud, there's a lot of different ways to get here. You can actually get here from the main dashboard using this profile icon. You can click on View Tag Cloud. We can also get here from the Opportunity Database. Up at the top of the page, we can click on View Tag Cloud. And in here, you can add stickers to any existing tags. So if you're going to do this sort of like court-ordered set of events, you'll want to create the tag first. But then once you've done that, you can click on this sort of Apply Sticker button next to that tag. You can also change it later. So I'll click on Update here. If we click on that, it takes us to a page where we can give this a title or a display name that your volunteers will see. And then you can pick between all these different icons. There are a lot of options in here. If you have any thoughts like, it'd be nice if we had this kind of icon for this subject, let us know. But you can go ahead and grab that through here. I think the one that I showed was a gavel, so it's in the G's. And then down at the bottom, you can choose whether this is displayed to volunteers and searchable or just displayed. I usually like to make these searchable. That way, if someone does kind of poke around, they can figure out they can click on that icon and it'll filter by that sticker. Okay, so again, this is the concept that we have a set of events that I have pre-labeled as being appropriate for court-ordered volunteers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone can just walk off the street and register for those. Perhaps I have an application process in place. I need to review their profile. They need to answer some questions, and I need to run a background check. Right? There can still be all of that process in place. But the idea in this scenario is that I am displaying a set of events to these volunteers, and I want them to start there and then go from that process. If your court-ordered or court-mandated volunteers just mix in with all the rest of your volunteers, you don't necessarily have a set that are specific to them, then you don't really need to worry about that portion, right? And you might still choose to put a label like this on all of your events if you want that to be more highly visible so everyone can see that. But you don't necessarily need to do that if court-ordered volunteers can really serve in any capacity as long as they've been approved. So let's talk about that second process. Do I have a process for, that second question. Do I have a process for approving community service volunteers? So if you have to approve community service volunteers, whether that's running a background check, just reviewing their answers to some questions about the nature of why they're doing community service, how many hours they need to complete, when those hours need to be completed by, then you need some way to identify that set of volunteers. There's a few different ways to approach this. I have one example kind of visible on this page right away. I have a service project that I've created where volunteers can see, you need to complete community service hours, start here. This is basically just to receive applications. So I'm kind of directing people's attention to this. I have pinned this event to the top of the page. We can see if I go into update this project down at the bottom. Under advanced options, I've pinned this to the top of the page so that it shows up always at the top. And then I just kind of have this as an open-ended project. So volunteers can apply for this if they're interested in being a community service volunteer, or if they need to be a community service volunteer. I might not necessarily set any restrictions on this, but the point of this type of project is if we go and look at that example again, so I'm going to go ahead and log out and go back to this page, you can see I've pinned that right to the top. So if someone goes to that landing page for community service volunteers, that's the first thing they see. It's at the top of the page and they can apply through here. So when they click on that project, it will have them go through. They can read more about it. I could add an image here if I wanted to, and then they basically apply. Now, I've set up this project so that it has some extra questions that aren't on my general application. So I'm using some custom registration questions. If you've not interacted with those before, we have a webinar on that subject too, but I will briefly show where those are. But if we go into apply here, you can see when a volunteer signs up, if they're new, they're going to create a new profile. If they're not new, so I'm just going to log in here, then it will basically just take them to a page to apply. And when they click submit, it will ask them to answer the other questions, right? So I have this, how many hours do you need to complete? They have to put a number in here. It's a required field. Then this, what's the deadline for completing your community service hours? They have to pick a date here, right? So this is a required field as well. Have you been charged with a felony? Yes or no? If you've been charged, please explain more. You can have as many questions like this as you want to, right? You can build this out kind of as robust as you need. These questions are only presented on this project. So if a volunteer is not applying through this project, they're not going to answer these questions. Now, I have other questions on my general application that might kind of help me understand if someone is a court-ordered volunteer and they maybe didn't understand that they were supposed to apply through this project. But these can be helpful if you need to kind of drill down into specifics, but you only want these asked of people who are applying because they are court-ordered or community service. So really briefly, again, these are custom registration questions. Again, we have an entire webinar on how to set those up or utilize those. But if we go back to the admin side here, every event or project has to the right this question mark icon, manage custom registration questions. If we click into that, then you can select from kind of a pool of questions you've created in the past. So I obviously have set up these questions related to court-ordered or court-mandated volunteers. You can generate new questions down at the bottom, click on Manage Registration Question Inventory, and then you just select all the applicable questions here, and you can move them around to reorder as well. Now, the answers to those questions get tacked on to the volunteer's application for this project, and then you can use that as a process for vetting the volunteers. I need to look and review these questions, and then I can decide if I want to approve or reject that person. So that kind of leads into the next point of, well, how would we approve this person? And there's a couple different ways that could take place. Again, your process may look very different from someone else's. Perhaps you need to run background checks. Perhaps you're just viewing this information and using that to vet the volunteer and kind of decide what they can or cannot do. But all of that has to do with, where do we store this information and how do we get that information on someone's profile? So if someone applies for this project and I review these questions and I decide, okay, they are approved, well, I need some way to contain that. So I also have, just generally on my application, a question that asks if a court-ordered volunteer is approved. So this is a question, a custom question that I've created. I'll show you the structure of this in a minute. This is pending by default. So this is always marked as pending unless I or someone on staff comes in here and changes this to yes or no. So this question is hidden from volunteers. They cannot see this, but I can go in and mark off, yes, they're approved or no, they're not approved. So I can update this on someone's profile and use that to kind of track where they're at. And I can even use this to set restrictions on events. I have another question too that I've created on my general application just to catch people that might slip through the cracks that asks, are you completing court-ordered community service hours? Right, so this is another custom question. This is visible to volunteers and they must select yes or no. That way I can kind of use the conjunction of these two questions to set restrictions on my events. We'll show that more in a minute. But then also if I need to identify someone who's court-ordered, I can search by that. Right? So this can be a way to identify that set of volunteers. So these two questions are a very common way to engage with court-ordered volunteers, even if you're not using something like that custom service project where people apply through that project. Sometimes just having these two questions on your application, again, one that's visible to volunteers and one that's hidden from volunteers, is sufficient because you can ask people if they're court-ordered. And if they say yes to this, that could prevent them from signing up for certain events that don't allow them to participate either at all or unless they've been approved, right? So let me show you how these were created, and then we'll get into kind of setting restrictions using those questions And then we'll also talk about background checks. We'll kind of dive into that next. So if we go into the system configuration under system management, this is where all of your application questions are housed. And in particular, this is where you can set up custom fields. So if we go into this section, we can create custom fields through here. And both of my examples are using custom selection list fields. So you can see this third one here. It says use field yes, meaning this is presented to volunteers. The field name is the question we're asking. Are you completing court-ordered community service hours? Yes or no. So volunteers must answer this when they create a profile. The question below that is a hidden field, meaning volunteers do not see this. The field name says if the volunteer is completing court-ordered community service, are they approved? Yes, no, or pending. And you can see that I set pending as the default. This is just to make it easier for me to identify if I've actually engaged with this person's profile before. Because if I haven't touched it, it'll be marked as pending. That is the default for every person, even though it's a hidden field. So volunteers don't see this. It gets marked as pending automatically, and then I can go in here and change this to either yes or no. So now what I can do is if someone creates a new profile, again, whether or not I'm using that service project to collect applications, I can go into the volunteer database. I can do an advanced search. And what I would actually do is have a saved search for this. So I wouldn't, manually run this every time. But I can go into the custom fields here and I can say, I want to find volunteers that said, yes, they are court ordered. And I also want to find those who have pending marked on their profile, meaning I have not yet touched that profile. That way I can go and search for that set. And if there are any to deal with, I would see those individuals pop up here. And then I can go through and choose to mark them as yes or no, whether or not they've been approved. So again, that type of search was an advanced search, but because we just ran that, I could also save it. And I would do this. That way you can create a saved search for pending court-ordered volunteers. And then that way you can always just go and quickly run that search without having to rerun, all of those things manually. Okay, so the benefit of those two questions on the general application is those are presented to everybody, right? The question of yes or no, are you court-ordered? So we're kind of catching people even if they didn't see that project that I've set up. But then also, those two questions can be used to set restrictions. So in particular, if we go in to create an event in the system, there's a section for creating restrictions. And in here, you can set restrictions by lots of different ideas, background checks, gender, age, custom fields, checklist items, groups. But with those two questions, those are both custom fields. What you can do is kind of use the conjunction of those questions to set restrictions. I can say, if someone has told me they are not court ordered, then I want them to be allowed to register. Generally speaking, the way restrictions work in service is that you are selecting who is permitted to register, not who's prevented from registering. So if this event allows volunteers who are not court ordered, then I would select no. But if I have someone who said they are court ordered, I only want them to be allowed to register if I have marked that they've been approved. So generally, selecting these two things covers sort of all of my cases. If someone has told me they're not court ordered, they can sign up directly. If someone has told me they are court ordered, they can only sign up if I have gone into their profile and marked that they have been approved. Now, this covers a wide gamut of processes. Maybe you're just checking their answers to that question of, what type of, offense or why, how many hours are you completing? When do those hours need to be completed by? Or was it a felony or not? Maybe you're just checking that information and then that's how you vet whether or not the volunteer can sign up for an event. So this obviously would work in that scenario. Perhaps you do some other kind of check where you call the court directly. Again, this could kind of cover that scenario as well because you are manually just saying they are approved. Now, you could have other questions or checklist items or things like that that kind of relate to specific items if you want to get very granular. But I've found that keeping it simple here is generally best. And this will kind of enable you to really track whatever you want to. And if you want to add in some kind of notes to the volunteer's profile, you can always do that as well. Now, I want to point out a couple other ways you can set restrictions. So obviously, you can use background checks. So you can say volunteers have to have passed a background check in order to register for this event. Now, obviously, this will apply to anyone who is registering. So if that only applies to court-ordered volunteers, you would need, again, some other method of doing that, because if you say everyone has to have passed a background check, that will apply to everyone. So again, using something like this, are they approved, might work better, because it also kind of reaches into that caveat of, well, I'm not even court-ordered, so I didn't need to do that in the first place, right? There's also one other type of restriction I wanted to point out, kind of in this realm. You could also manually create a group of volunteers that are called court-ordered volunteers, and you could specifically deny that that group is allowed to register. So earlier I mentioned that the restrictions in service are you're selecting who's allowed to register. This is an exception to that. So I've created a group in my system for court-mandated volunteers, and I could say specifically that this group of people are not allowed to register. So that's a separate sort of restriction specifically applied to groups. You may not have seen this before. If you're familiar with group restrictions in service, this was added relatively recently. So if you have needed to do that in the past, specifically deny a set of people entry to a certain event, this is how you can do that. So you can select multiple groups in here and say anyone in any of these groups is not, sorry, I should say none. Anyone in I guess the actual language is volunteers who are in none of these groups are allowed to register. So it's still kind of that saying you're permitting who's allowed to register. So that would mean if someone is in this group, they cannot. Okay, so those are kind of the different restrictions. Now, what I'm showing right here, I wouldn't actually do the combination of both of these things. They're sort of conflicting. You would be doing one or the other when you're doing restrictions like this. Or perhaps you're doing a background check restriction and again, not doing court ordered. It just kind of depends on what are your requirements. You know, who is allowed to register? What are court ordered volunteers allowed to do? Can they register directly? Do you need to approve them? Then, you know, you might need to lean into different restrictions based on what your process looks like. Now, at the top, I kind of asked two questions. Do you have a particular set of opportunities? And do you have a particular process for community service volunteers? Your answer to those two questions don't always have to be kind of yes or no directly. Those two kind of can work together. You might have a particular set and also a process in place for approving those volunteers. But those two things are really what kind of drive how you set up your opportunities and how you post different things for court-ordered volunteers. There are a couple concepts that I quickly glossed over that I want to make sure to point out and really drive home sort of what these are used for. So in particular, I showed an example of a sort of application for court-ordered volunteers. This is the concept that I'm using a service project without the desire to actually have volunteers record hours into this project. You can think of this more as like an application. So someone would start here, as kind of the name implies. They would click into this and apply for this project, answer those custom questions, build out their profile in total, and then I would go from there. Right? When someone applies for a service project, you can be notified. I have that turned on in that case. So I would get an email every time someone applies, and then they wind up in this inbox as well. So then you can go through and see who applied for that project. You can go and view their answers to the custom questions, view their profile, update their profile directly through here if you want to go and say, okay, they are approved. So I want to mark that as yes, they are approved, even though they are court ordered or whatever the case may be, right? So you can go and update directly through their profile, and then you can send them an email through here and then have, let them know, okay, you're approved to sign up for events now, and then maybe send them that link to a specific set of opportunities, right? So that's kind of the concept behind this service project. It's really functioning more like a container or an initial application. I'm not actually letting people record hours into this. It's just a way for them to get on my radar, and then I can begin the process from there. This is one way to do it. It's not end all be all. Oftentimes I don't see this, and instead I just see a question on the application where someone says, Asks volunteers, are you court ordered? Yes or no. And then you use that search that I mentioned, right? You save a search that says, show me all the volunteers who are court ordered, who have not yet been approved or rejected, right? And then you use that as your criteria for finding those volunteers and then maybe sending them an email. So the other case is you might have a scenario where you don't need to necessarily approve them, but you do want to identify them because there's a certain set of events that they can register for. In that case, it's just a little bit scaled back. It's a little bit simpler. So what you do is when you set up your opportunities, you still set restrictions, but you say, for this event, we don't allow court-ordered volunteers at all. And for the events where you do allow them, then you don't have a restriction related to that. Maybe you still have an age restriction or something else, but you just don't use that restriction at all. In those scenarios, I think it's best to make sure you use a tag so that you can identify those events and send them to the volunteers, maybe even make a button on your website so people can click and see only court-ordered opportunities or court mandated. But in that scenario, it's a little bit simpler. You're not necessarily going through the whole process. You just have a specific set that you're directing people to. Okay, and then one other thing that we sort of glossed over, again, we have a webinar on this subject entirely, but running background checks. Within CERVIS, we have an integration with backgrounds online, so you can order background checks within your Service console, get notified when they've been completed, go through, view the report, and then mark them as passed or failed in the system. But you can also use whatever vendor you need to and just manually mark that on someone's profile. So if we go into someone's account, you can update their profile and you can go through and mark this person passed a background check. Here's when they passed it, right? And then again, this can be used as a restriction as well. So all of those different things kind of pile up to create the different ways that you might display a set of events to court-ordered volunteers or create restrictions using custom fields or background checks or perhaps groups as well. And then you kind of can build out your events to be displayed, kind of following that scheme. So what I think is most important from my perspective is just being very clear to your volunteers that, this is the set of opportunities that you can sign up for. So again, tagging them, I think, is a very useful tool. But then also making sure that you have language in different parts of the system that help people understand what's required or what's enabled, or what they're allowed to do. Kind of in that vein, there's one more thing that I want to talk about regarding setting restrictions. For any opportunity where you have set a restriction, let's say for court mandated volunteers, right? So let's use the example we used earlier. Are you completing court-ordered community service hours? Yes or no? So we want people who've said no. And if they are court-ordered, I want to have approved them. Well, volunteers do not see this restriction. It's hidden. So a volunteer will have this acted upon them. If they try to register and they don't meet the requirements, they're going to get rejected. So what you might want to do is set up a custom failure message that says, if you are court ordered, please go here first and send them to that project, right? Or ask them to email you or do something like that. That way you can kind of catch those people. And instead of just saying thanks, but no thanks, kind of the default message, the default failure message says, thanks for your interest. You don't meet the requirements. Contact an admin for more information. It's not going to give them all kinds of data because you don't necessarily want the system exposing that info. So what I usually like to do is to tune this message to give them something else to do, right? Say, hey, if you're court ordered, you need to go to this set of opportunities, and kind of point them towards that on your website or wherever you've posted that. Or perhaps just ask them to email you, right? So this is kind of an important thing, just making sure the language tells people what they should do next. Okay, there's one final kind of subject within the world of court-ordered volunteers, and then we'll get into some questions that have come along. So please feel free to continue asking those. And that would be reporting. So what can we do with reports for court-ordered volunteers? First, from the admin perspective, you can obviously run a search for all of your volunteers who are court-ordered, right? We created that search earlier based on the combination of are you court-ordered and have you been approved? But we can also just say, show me all the court-ordered volunteers based on that search or perhaps some tag you've created or anything in that range. But we can run a search like that. then we can select all those people, and then we can create a printout through here if we're just exporting information. But if I want to run a report on those volunteers, I would then go into report management and use one of the reports that allows me to apply a query. So in particular, like this first report here, I can say use my previous search or perhaps a saved search. And then from there, I can select as much data as I want to, apply a date range, and then run the report. Right. So if you're looking to view all of your hours served by court-ordered volunteers, then you'll want to use something like that. Now, the other kind of portion of that is a lot of times court-ordered volunteers need maybe like a printout, right? So you can do that from the volunteer's profile, and the volunteer can do that themselves. If we go into a volunteer's account, so we'll just use an example here. If I click into view someone's registrations, on this page, I can set a date range. The default is last year into next year, but maybe I only want to view, let's say, this calendar year, right? So I can go back and set a date range of, year to date, basically. I can filter this page. I can select those opportunities. And then down at the bottom, I can say print out a summary as a PDF or as a Word document. This PDF is actually something that volunteers can produce themselves. But it basically has your letterhead at the top. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then it has all of the hours that we just selected, right? So we get a summary here. If any of these have not yet been completed or are in process, they might not count towards the total, right? So this is pending. It has not yet happened, so the hours are not yet attributed. If we had selected events in the future, they would say scheduled. But we get the total down here, and then you can also see at the bottom of each page, there's a verification tool. So if the volunteer prints this out and hands this in somewhere, the person they hand it into can go to this link and input this code, or alternatively, just scan this QR code, and that would produce a verified copy of this report. So like I said, volunteers can actually print this document themselves. If a volunteer logs into their account, and you can kind of emulate this with your profile, if you go to the profile icon here, you can view the system from the volunteer perspective. There's an option in here to print out your activity history. So under report management, so you can go view or print volunteer activity history from here, set a date range, filter it, select all your events, and then down at the bottom, click on print report or email. Email will just send it to the email address on file, but it's that same PDF report. Print report will automatically download it, right? And again, this is the exact same concept. Now, I mentioned letterhead at the top of this report. If you print this out and you do not see this, this is a setting in your system configuration. What you can do is just submit a ticket to our customer support team, include whatever letterhead or logo you want to appear at the top of the page. If you just want to use the same logo that's throughout your console, let our team know, and they'll go ahead and do that for you. But that way, this will get automatically included when volunteers print out their own activity history. One final thing about this particular report is that we do have a video. If you go to, again, video.servicetech.com, we have a video that shows volunteers how to print out their activity history. It is basically just those steps. So if you want to share this with your volunteers, please feel free to do so. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to move into some questions that came up throughout that. Again, please feel free to continue writing those in. This is obviously a very unique subject for each organization, so you might have things that are more specific to what you're doing. But a question came in. We have volunteers who start as court-ordered and then continue on. Would we just manually change their profile once their hours are completed if they still want to serve? Yeah, that's a great question. That is probably what I would do in that scenario. Just update their account and say they're no longer court-ordered. And then you can maybe add a note or potentially a tag to their profile is how I would handle that. So if you have not added notes to a volunteer profile, it's important that you know that those are not visible to volunteers. If we go into update someone's profile, at the bottom of the page is a section where you can add volunteer notes. So we could go in here and say previously court ordered, and then I would maybe include some notes about like the date or how many hours or whatever, right? You can add that note in here. Your volunteers do not see this information, but you can see who wrote the note, when it was written, and obviously what the note says. And all of this is searchable. Alternatively, you might also just add a tag into the volunteer's profile to identify that they are previously court ordered, something like that, right? And then you could search for that set of volunteers if you need to. Okay, next question that came in. Can anyone with leadership team access see the court answer information? How do we keep it private to very few staff? That's a great question. When you are setting up custom fields in the system configuration, so we're going to go back in there and we're going to go under custom volunteer profile fields. In this section, when you are creating a custom field, the use field option dictates who has permission to view this information. If you want to see kind of all of the settings and how they all work, there's an information box here that lays everything out. But if you're very quick, you might have noticed there's one that says hidden admin only. There's also one that says private admin only. These are a little bit different. So hidden admin only is exactly what it sounds like. Volunteers cannot see this. Leadership team cannot see this. Group leaders, event leaders, nobody can see this except for administrators. So this is what you would want to do in that scenario. The private admin only makes it so that the volunteer can see it and administrators. So that's a little bit different than what we're talking about with the hidden. Hidden is what you want to do in that scenario. And I should be very clear. Private also only allows the volunteer to input the information once. So they give it to you initially, kind of. Okay. And then the last question here for today, someone had asked again where we find that tag cloud. And that's a good question. There are a lot of places you can get there. Again, the profile icon in the upper right-hand corner, whenever you're logged in, you can go into View Tag Cloud. This is, again, where you would add stickers. You can also get here from the volunteer database, the opportunity database, and the group database. There's a lot of places where you can get here. If you go in through the opportunity database to search and manage existing opportunities, there's a button up at the top that says View Tag Cloud. You'll notice this blue cloud icon. That also shows up all over the place. If I go into an opportunity, up at the top, we can see that same icon here. So again, there are a lot of different places where you can get to that question or get to that different page, and they'll all kind of take you to the same place. Okay, there's one other question we're going to address here today, and that is going back to background check tracking. So I mentioned that you can use the integration with Backgrounds Online. We're not going to dig into all of that here today. We do have a webinar on that subject. So if you'd like to learn more about that integration, again, if you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you to our YouTube channel. But you can see here, if I click into view our videos, this will sort by kind of most recent. And our last webinar was on this subject. So if you want to learn more about that integration with Backgrounds Online, this webinar will go through that. It also talks about working with other vendors. There's no other integration in Service directly. But if you want to just mark on someone's profile, then you can go into that person's account. If we go into the volunteer database here and we click into update someone's profile, you can scroll down and engage with their background check complete and background check date fields. So if you're using a different vendor, you can just manually update this on someone's profile. Okay. Well, I know that was a lot of information today. We covered kind of different ways that you can choose to engage with court-ordered volunteers in terms of identifying that set of volunteers or even potentially isolating them to a specific set of opportunities. A lot of it has to do with understanding your process and what your needs are. So if you have further questions about creating, specific events for court-ordered volunteers or how to identify that set of volunteers, please feel free to continue to ask questions through our customer support tool. If you are logged in, at the bottom of the page, you can see a Need Help button. No matter which page you're on, click on that. Type in a question here or a topic if you want to see articles that are related to that. There's a lot of good information in here, and we do keep this information up to date. But regardless what you've searched by, you can always click on Contact Us and submit a ticket through here. So if you have further questions about how to engage with your volunteers or your scenario, if it didn't fit neatly into one of the things that I described, don't be alarmed. Everyone is obviously a little bit unique in terms of how they need to engage with people. So please feel free to ask away and we can help you understand what kind of best practices to use in your scenario. So this is a really helpful tool. Make sure you utilize this. This is just a part of your system. So please submit tickets through there. And then again, we have other webinars on different subjects like background checks and working with groups and things like that that might be useful in those other scenarios that you're running into. So thank you again for your time today. As you do have more questions, please feel free to ask away. We're going to go ahead and shut it down for today, though. So thanks for your time. Hope you have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you in the next month.